Daniel Brooks lifted his champagne and laughed as the crowd at the charity gala turned toward Emma Carter. "My ex-wife," he said loudly. "The woman who couldn't survive without my money." A few guests chuckled. Emma didn't argue. She simply glanced at the grand ballroom doors as if waiting. Daniel smirked. "Still pretending you belong here." Suddenly the chandeliers dimmed, and the host announcement echoed across the marble hall. The doors opened. A tall man in a midnight tuxedo stepped in, security behind him. The billionaire Alexander Hayes walked straight to Emma, took her hand, and said softly, "Sorry I'm late, Mrs. Hayes." Daniel's smile vanished as the room fell completely silent. The most dangerous mistake a man can make is believing the woman he humiliated will stay broken. Emma Carter paused at the entrance of the Grand Regent Hotel, her hand resting lightly on the cool brass handle of the towering glass doors. Inside, the annual Hawthorne Foundation Charity Gala shimmered with quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light across polished marble floors. Waiters in black jackets moved through the ballroom, carrying silver trays of champagne flutes that caught the light like tiny stars. The soft hum of expensive conversations floated through the air, layered with the scent of fresh orchids and designer perfume. Emma took a slow breath and stepped inside. The emerald silk of her dress brushed against her ankles as she walked across the lobby, the fabric catching the glow of the chandeliers. She hadn't worn this dress in years. Not since the night someone told her it was too bold for a quiet woman. Tonight it felt exactly right. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago on thick cream cardstock with embossed gold lettering. Hawthorne Foundation Annual Gala. She had almost thrown it away. Events like this belonged to a world she had left behind 3 years earlier. A world of polished smiles, quiet judgment, and carefully hidden cruelty. But something inside her had refused to let the envelope land in the trash. Now, as the ballroom doors opened and the music spilled toward her, she understood why. Because standing near the center of the room, surrounded by investors and socialites, was Daniel Brooks, her ex-husband. Daniel looked exactly the same as he always had under bright lights. Tall, confident, a perfectly tailored tuxedo fitting him like it had been made that morning. His dark hair was styled with the same effortless precision that once made magazine photographers love him. And on his arm was a woman at least 10 years younger, glowing under the chandelier light in a red designer gown. The woman leaned into him, laughing at something he had said, her hand resting comfortably on his sleeve as if she had always belonged there. Emma slowed her steps. For a moment the room seemed to tilt slightly, the echo of old memories brushing against her like cold air. 3 years ago she had stood beside Daniel at events just like this one, smiling politely while he spoke about success, ambition, and the future he claimed they were building together. 3 years ago she had believed him. A waiter passed by, and Emma picked up a glass of sparkling water from the tray. The cold condensation against her fingertips steadied her. Across the ballroom Daniel turned slightly, greeting another guest. And then his eyes landed on her. The change in his expression was immediate. First confusion, then recognition, then something sharper. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Daniel leaned down and murmured something to the woman beside him. The woman followed his gaze and looked directly at Emma. Her eyebrows lifted in mild curiosity. Daniel straightened his jacket, lifted his champagne glass, and began walking toward her through the crowd. Conversations softened as he passed, people instinctively making space for him. Emma remained where she stood, calm, her posture relaxed as if she had been expecting this moment all evening. Daniel stopped a few feet away, looking her up and down with a slow, deliberate glance. His smile widened. "Emma Carter," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Well, this is unexpected." The woman beside him folded her arms politely, watching. Daniel tilted his head slightly, amusement glinting in his eyes. "I didn't realize the Hawthorne Gala had lowered its guest list this year." A few nearby guests chuckled softly, pretending not to stare. Emma lifted her glass and took a small sip, her expression unreadable. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal, but not private. "Tell me something," he said. "Are you here by accident, or are you still pretending you belong in rooms like this?" Emma set her glass gently onto a passing tray. Her gaze drifted past him toward the grand ballroom doors at the far end of the hall. The doors that had remained closed all evening. The doors that would soon open. And for the first time that night, a faint smile touched the corner of her lips. Because Daniel Brooks believed this room still belonged to him. What he didn't know was that the night hadn't even started yet. Daniel let the silence stretch just long enough for the nearby guests to lean closer, curious for whatever would come next. He lifted his champagne glass slightly, the crystal catching the chandelier light above them. "You never did like attention, Emma," he said with a soft laugh, his voice smooth and confident. "Yet somehow you always manage to appear exactly where it is." The woman beside him studied Emma with polite interest, her red dress shimmering as she shifted her weight. "Daniel," she said lightly, "are you not going to introduce me?" Daniel smiled as if remembering his manners. "Of course. Emma Carter, this is Vanessa Cole. Vanessa is my fiancée." Vanessa extended a manicured hand with a gracious smile that felt more curious than kind. "It is nice to meet you," she said. Emma shook her hand briefly. "Likewise." Daniel watched the exchange with obvious amusement, swirling the pale gold liquid in his glass. "Vanessa is a partner in a luxury marketing firm," he continued, speaking loudly enough that the surrounding circle of guests could easily hear. "She actually understands how this world works." Vanessa laughed politely, though a faint tension flickered in her eyes. Daniel turned his attention back to Emma, tilting his head slightly, as if examining an artifact from another life. "Tell me something," he said. "What have you been doing these days? Still working those small freelance projects?" Someone behind him chuckled softly. Another guest leaned closer, pretending to adjust the cuff of his tuxedo while clearly listening. Emma rested one hand lightly against the stem of a nearby cocktail table. Her posture remained relaxed, her breathing steady. "I have been busy," she replied simply. Daniel nodded slowly as though humoring a child. "Busy," he repeated. "That is good. Staying busy helps people move on." He lifted his glass again, addressing the nearby group, now forming a loose semicircle around them. "Emma always believed success would just appear if you waited long enough," he said with a charming smile. "I suppose patience is one. Strategy." The laughter this time was louder. Vanessa placed a hand on Daniel's arm, her smile still fixed but slightly tighter now. "Daniel," she murmured, though she did not actually stop him. Daniel leaned closer to Emma, lowering his voice just enough to sound conversational while still allowing the others to hear. "You know," he said, "I almost admire the confidence it took for you to walk into a room like this tonight." His eyes glinted with satisfaction. Events like this are not exactly casual dinner parties. Emma glanced briefly across the ballroom. The orchestra in the far corner shifted into a softer melody. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays filled with fresh glasses. Guests continued drifting toward the center of the room as the evening settled into its rhythm. Daniel followed her gaze. "Looking for someone?" he asked with a faint smirk. Emma turned her attention back to him. For a brief moment her expression softened, almost thoughtful. "Just observing," she said quietly. Daniel laughed again, raising his voice slightly. "Observing. That sounds about right." A tall man in a navy suit leaned toward Daniel. "Brooks, are you hosting tonight?" he asked casually. Daniel shook his head. "No, but I have been invited often enough that it practically feels like it." The guests around him chuckled again. Emma's eyes drifted once more toward the grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom. They were still closed, but now several staff members in black jackets had quietly taken their places along the walls. The stage lights near the podium flickered once, almost imperceptibly. Emma's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the table beside her. Daniel noticed the movement. "You seem distracted," he said. "Expecting someone important?" Emma met his gaze calmly. "Something like that." Daniel smiled with renewed amusement. "Emma," he said softly, "the only important people in this room are already here." Behind him, somewhere near the ballroom entrance, a deep mechanical hum rolled through the quiet hallway beyond the doors. It was the unmistakable sound of multiple car engines arriving outside the hotel at the same time. Emma's faint smile returned, subtle but unmistakable, because for the first time that evening, the night was finally beginning to unfold. The faint hum of engines outside the Grand Regent Hotel rolled through the marble hallway like distant thunder. Several guests near the ballroom entrance turned their heads instinctively, curiosity rippling through the room. Daniel Brooks barely noticed. He was still smiling at Emma, confident, comfortable, certain the night belonged to him. You always did enjoy dramatic pauses, he said lightly. But I promise you, Emma, nothing exciting is about to happen. A few people around them laughed again, though softer this time as attention began drifting toward the far end of the ballroom. Emma did not respond immediately. Her gaze had already shifted past Daniel, toward the towering double doors framed by gold trim and soft amber lighting. The orchestra's music faded gently as a member of the event staff approached the podium near the stage. The quiet adjustment of a microphone sent a small ripple of sound through the speakers. Conversation slowed. Guests turned their bodies slightly toward the stage. Daniel glanced over his shoulder briefly, then back to Emma. Looks like the program is starting, he said. Maybe you should find a seat. Emma tilted her head slightly. Maybe. The staff member at the podium cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice warm and practiced. Thank you for joining us tonight at the Hawthorne Foundation Annual Charity Gala. A polite wave of applause moved through the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead as hundreds of tiny reflections shimmered across the marble floor. Daniel adjusted his cuff links with a faint smile, already preparing to turn away from Emma and rejoin the crowd that normally orbited him. But then the announcer continued. Before we begin tonight's program, we would like to welcome the host of this evening's event. The words drifted across the room like a quiet spark. Daniel paused. Several guests near the entrance turned completely around now. A line of hotel staff suddenly stepped aside from the massive ballroom doors. The orchestra fell silent. The doors opened slowly with a deep polished sound. Cool night air slipped into the warm ballroom as the entrance revealed a corridor lined with security staff and black-suited drivers visible through the glass beyond. Outside, several long black luxury cars had just pulled to a stop beneath the hotel's golden canopy lights. A tall figure stepped through the doorway. The man moved with calm, unhurried confidence, his midnight blue tuxedo perfectly tailored, the crisp white of his shirt catching the light as he entered the room. Conversation stopped entirely now. Guests leaned toward one another. In hushed recognition, Daniel's smile faded slightly as he turned to look more closely. The announcer's voice rose again through the quiet ballroom. Please welcome Mr. Alexander Hayes, founder of the Hawthorne Foundation. A murmur spread across the crowd. The name carried weight. Even Daniel recognized it immediately. Alexander Hayes, technology investor, billionaire, one of the youngest philanthropic founders in the country. Alexander walked forward slowly, greeting several board members with brief nods as he crossed the marble floor. But his eyes were not scanning the room the way most hosts would. They were fixed on one point ahead of him. Emma Carter. Daniel felt a small flicker of confusion as the man approached. Vanessa shifted beside him, whispering softly, "Is that him?" Daniel did not answer. Alexander Hayes stopped directly in front of Emma. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment the two of them simply looked at each other. Then Alexander smiled warmly and reached for her hand with effortless familiarity. I apologize for the delay, he said gently. Traffic on Fifth Avenue was worse than expected tonight. Emma's smile deepened slightly. You made it, she replied. The words were quiet but perfectly clear in the silent room. Alexander turned slightly toward the podium, still holding Emma's hand. The announcer continued with a bright voice that carried across every table in the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the hosts of tonight's charity gala, Mr. Alexander Hayes and his wife, Mrs. Emma Hayes. Somewhere behind them, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered softly against the marble floor. Daniel Brooks stood completely still, staring as the meaning of those words slowly settled over the entire room. For several seconds no one spoke. The echo of the announcer's words seemed to linger in the vast ballroom like the final note of a symphony. Mrs. Emma Hayes. The name moved through the crowd in quiet whispers as guests turned toward one another in disbelief. Daniel Brooks felt the world tilt slightly beneath his polished shoes. His fingers tightened around the stem of his champagne glass as he stared at the scene unfolding only a few feet away. Alexander Hayes still held Emma's hand gently, as though the moment was the most natural thing in the world. The billionaire's posture was calm, composed, the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his place in any room. Daniel's mind struggled to connect the woman standing before him with the name the announcer had just spoken. Emma Hayes. His Emma. The same woman he had just mocked minutes earlier in front of half the ballroom. Vanessa shifted beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel, did they just say Hayes? Daniel did not answer. Across the room, a low murmur grew louder as recognition spread among the guests. Some faces lit with surprise, others with curiosity. A few of the foundation board members were already stepping forward to greet Alexander warmly. But Alexander's attention remained on Emma. His thumb brushed lightly across the back of her hand, a quiet gesture of familiarity that did not escape the crowd's notice. Emma stood effortlessly beside him, her emerald dress catching the chandelier light like a deep green jewel. She looked neither triumphant nor embarrassed, only calm. Daniel suddenly became aware of the dozens of eyes now drifting toward him. A few guests who had been laughing moments earlier quickly turned away, pretending to examine the decor or sip their drinks. The social air in the room had shifted in an instant. Vanessa slowly withdrew her hand from Daniel's arm, sensing the tension tightening around him. Alexander finally turned toward the podium as the announcer continued speaking about the evening's charitable initiatives, but before moving away, he glanced briefly toward Daniel. It was not a hostile look. It was not even judgmental. It was something far worse. Indifference, as though Daniel Brooks was simply another unfamiliar guest in a crowded room. Emma noticed the glance as well. For the first time since Daniel had approached her earlier that evening, she looked directly at him again. Her expression remained composed, almost gentle. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for revenge, only a quiet certainty that the past no longer held any power over her. The orchestra slowly resumed playing, filling the silence with soft strings as guests began moving again. Waiters circulated with fresh trays of champagne, while conversations restarted in cautious murmurs. Alexander leaned slightly toward Emma, speaking in a low voice that only she could hear. "Are you ready?" Emma nodded once. Together they began walking toward the stage at the front of the ballroom. The crowd naturally parted for them, guests stepping aside with respectful smiles as the hosts of the evening made their way forward. Daniel remained frozen where he stood, watching as the woman he had once dismissed as insignificant moved gracefully through a room that now clearly belonged to her. Vanessa finally broke the silence beside him. "You said she was just someone from your past." Daniel swallowed slowly, his confidence dissolving under the weight of what he was witnessing. On the stage, Alexander Hayes reached the podium, and the room gradually quieted again. He adjusted the microphone and looked out across the audience with an easy smile. "Good evening, everyone," he began warmly. "Tonight is about generosity, opportunity, and the belief that every life deserves a second chance." Emma stood beside him, her hands lightly folded, listening as the applause rolled through the ballroom. But before the speech could continue, Alexander paused briefly and turned toward her with a thoughtful expression. "Although," he added with a small smile, "sometimes second chances come in ways none of us expect." Across the room, Daniel Brooks felt the meaning of those words settle heavily in the air. The applause slowly faded as Alexander Hayes stepped slightly back from the microphone, allowing the orchestra's soft melody to settle over the ballroom once again. The golden chandelier light shimmered across the crowd, reflecting off polished marble floors and crystal glasses. Emma stood beside him with quiet composure, her emerald dress catching the light every time she moved. From the far side of the room, Daniel Brooks still had not taken his eyes off the stage. His mind replayed the last 10 minutes again and again, trying to find some mistake in what he had just heard. Mrs. Emma Hayes. The name echoed in his thoughts like a quiet accusation. Vanessa leaned closer to him, lowering her voice. "You never mentioned that your ex-wife was married to Alexander Hayes." Daniel forced a breath through his nose, still staring toward the stage. "Because she was not," he said quietly. Vanessa looked at him carefully. Clearly something changed. Daniel did not answer. On stage, Alexander continued speaking, his voice calm and confident as he addressed the audience about the foundation's mission. "The Hawthorne Foundation exists for one simple reason," he said. "To give people opportunities they may have once believed were impossible." Several guests nodded thoughtfully, while others lifted their glasses in appreciation. Emma listened beside him, her expression serene. She had heard this speech many times before, but tonight felt different, because somewhere in the back of the ballroom, the past she had spent 3 years rebuilding her life from was standing only 30 feet away. Alexander turned slightly toward her again, his voice warm. Many of you know our work through our scholarships, housing programs, and education initiatives, he said. But the truth is, the heart of this foundation did not begin with me. A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. Emma glanced at him briefly, surprised. Alexander's eyes softened with quiet pride. It began with someone who reminded me that resilience is not loud, he continued. It is patient. It is steady. And sometimes it stands quietly in a room where people once believed it did not belong. The audience followed his gaze as he gently gestured toward Emma. A wave of applause rolled through the ballroom again, louder this time. Some guests smiled warmly. Others whispered excitedly to one another. Cameras from the event photographers flashed softly near the stage. Emma felt the warmth of the lights and the attention, but remained composed, her posture graceful. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched the moment unfold. Vanessa folded her arms slowly. "Daniel," she said quietly, "what exactly happened between you two?" Daniel finally looked away from the stage, though the sound of applause still filled his ears. "Nothing," he said quickly, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Back on stage, Alexander placed one hand gently over Emma's. 3 years ago, he continued, Emma and I met during a volunteer project that supported small community schools in New York. She believed that every child deserved a chance to succeed, no matter their background. Emma lowered her eyes modestly as the audience listened closely. That belief eventually grew into something much larger, Alexander said with a smile. Tonight we are proud to announce a new initiative that will fund educational programs across 20 states over the next 5 years. The ballroom erupted in applause once again. But across the room, Daniel Brooks felt something very different settling in his chest. Because for the first time that evening, he realized the woman he had mocked only minutes earlier was not simply attending this gala. She had helped build the very foundation it was celebrating. The applause continued to roll across the ballroom like a slow rising tide, filling the vast space beneath the chandeliers with warmth and admiration. Emma Hayes stood beside Alexander as the crowd celebrated the announcement, the golden lights above reflecting in hundreds of lifted champagne glasses. From the stage, the entire room looked different, almost surreal, like watching a quiet storm of recognition unfold. Emma's eyes moved calmly across the audience until, for a brief moment, they landed on Daniel Brooks. He was still standing in the same place near the back of the ballroom, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and realization. The distance between them was only a few dozen feet, yet it felt like an entirely different lifetime. Alexander allowed the applause to settle before speaking again. His voice carried easily through the quieting room, smooth and steady. None of this would exist without people who believed in rebuilding, he said. People who understand that the most powerful success stories rarely begin in comfort. They begin in resilience. Several guests nodded thoughtfully, while others leaned toward their tables, clearly intrigued by the story behind the foundation's origin. Emma remained composed, but her mind drifted briefly through the years that had led to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had walked away from a life that had slowly erased her confidence piece by piece. A marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but had quietly taught her she was never quite enough. The memory did not sting anymore. It felt distant now, like a chapter in a book she had already closed. Alexander glanced at her again, a quiet smile touching his expression. Emma once told me something I never forgot, he continued. She said that when someone underestimates you, they reveal far more about themselves than they ever will about you. A ripple of soft laughter and approving murmurs moved through the crowd. Emma lowered her gaze briefly, slightly embarrassed by the attention but unable to hide the warmth in her eyes. Across the ballroom, Daniel felt the words settle heavily in the air. He remembered the nights years ago when Emma had tried to explain her ideas for community programs and educational support. Ideas he had dismissed with a careless shrug. At the time, he had believed ambition belonged only to the people who spoke the loudest. Now he watched as an entire room listened to the woman he once thought would never succeed without him. Vanessa shifted beside him again, studying the stage with growing curiosity. She built this with him, she said quietly. Daniel nodded once, though the motion felt stiff. Apparently, he replied. On stage, Alexander stepped away from the microphone for a moment and turned toward Emma, offering her a gentle gesture inviting her forward. The audience responded with immediate applause again, encouraging her to speak. Emma hesitated only a second before stepping closer to the podium. Her voice, when it came, was calm and clear. 3 years ago, I believed my life had collapsed, she said honestly. The ballroom fell completely silent. But sometimes losing the life you thought you wanted is the only way to discover the one you were meant to build. Several guests exchanged thoughtful looks while others leaned forward, captivated. Emma's eyes briefly swept across the room again before returning to the microphone. She did not search for Daniel. She did not need to. This foundation exists because second chances matter, she continued gently. Because everyone deserves the opportunity to stand up again and discover who they really are. Another wave of applause filled the ballroom, louder than before. And standing quietly near the back of the room, Daniel Brooks realized that the woman he once believed would fade away had not only rebuilt her life. She had quietly built something far greater than he had ever imagined. The applause slowly softened into a warm murmur that drifted across the ballroom like a gentle tide retreating from the shore. Emma stepped back from the microphone as the orchestra resumed its quiet melody, the violins filling the high-ceilinged room with a calm elegance that matched the evening's atmosphere. Alexander placed a reassuring hand at the small of her back as they stepped aside from the podium, allowing the event coordinators to prepare for the next segment of the program. From the stage, the crowd looked like a sea of polished glass and shimmering gowns, but Emma's eyes moved across it calmly, no longer searching for approval, no longer feeling the old tension that once lived in rooms like this. Near the back of the ballroom, Daniel Brooks remained still, his champagne untouched in his hand. Around him, conversations had resumed, but the tone had changed. Guests who had laughed earlier now spoke more cautiously, their voices low and thoughtful. A few of them glanced occasionally toward Daniel before quickly looking away again, as if suddenly unsure how close they wanted to stand to someone who had so clearly underestimated the woman now standing on the stage. Vanessa studied the room carefully, then looked back toward Daniel. "You told me she struggled after the divorce," she said quietly. Daniel stared at the stage where Emma and Alexander were now speaking with members of the foundation board. "That was 3 years ago," he replied. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. 3 years is a long time when someone decides to prove everyone wrong. Daniel did not answer. Instead, he watched as Emma spoke with a group of donors who clearly admired her, their smiles genuine, their posture respectful. It was a kind of respect Daniel realized he had never truly given her during their marriage. On stage, Alexander leaned closer to Emma, his voice low enough that the audience could not hear. "You handled that beautifully," he said. Emma smiled faintly. "I was not expecting you to mention our first conversation tonight." Alexander's eyes softened with quiet humor. "Some stories deserve to be told," he replied. Emma glanced across the ballroom again, this time noticing Daniel standing near the back of the room. For a brief second their eyes met. But instead of tension or bitterness, Emma felt only a quiet sense of distance. The man she had once built her life around now felt like a stranger passing through a place that no longer belonged to him. The orchestra shifted into a brighter melody as waiters began serving the first course of the evening. Guests returned to their tables, though many still glanced toward the stage with curiosity and admiration. Alexander offered Emma his arm with an easy smile. "Come," he said gently. "The donors are going to want to meet you properly now." Emma slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, and together they stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted again with natural respect, several guests greeting them warmly as they passed. Near the back of the room, Daniel finally set his untouched glass onto a passing tray. For the first time that evening, he understood something that had never occurred to him during the years he had known Emma Carter. The woman he had believed needed him to succeed had never actually needed him at all. She had only needed the chance to become the person she was always meant to be. Soft conversation returned to the ballroom like a slow rising breeze as the first course was served across the elegant round tables. Silver utensils glinted beneath the chandeliers while waiters moved smoothly between guests carrying porcelain plates and crystal pitchers of sparkling water. The atmosphere had changed in a way that was subtle yet impossible to ignore. Only an hour earlier, the room had been filled with the quiet confidence of social routine. Now curiosity and admiration hummed beneath nearly every conversation. Emma walked beside Alexander through the center of the ballroom as donors and foundation partners greeted them warmly. Several guests rose from their chairs when she approached, offering handshakes and kind words about the speech she had just given. One elderly philanthropist with silver hair smiled at her with genuine respect. "Mrs. Hayes, that was one of the most sincere speeches I have heard at this event in years," he said. Emma thanked him politely, her voice calm but warm. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention, but tonight felt different. Tonight the attention was not about appearance or status. It was about something she had helped build with purpose. Across the room, Daniel Brooks remained near the back wall where the lighting was slightly dimmer. Vanessa had moved toward the bar to order a drink, leaving him standing alone among a cluster of guests who were now speaking quietly about the foundation's new initiative. Daniel listened without meaning to as one man said thoughtfully, "The Hayes Foundation Scholarship Program already helped thousands of students last year. Expanding to 20 states will change entire communities." Another guest nodded. And apparently Emma Hayes was involved in designing the program structure from the beginning. That woman clearly knows what she is doing. Daniel felt the words land heavier than he expected. He looked toward the center of the ballroom again, where Emma stood speaking with a group of university donors. The confidence in her posture was unmistakable now. She moved easily through conversations, listening carefully, asking thoughtful questions, offering ideas that people seemed eager to hear. The woman he remembered from years earlier had often hesitated to speak during events like this, allowing Daniel to dominate every conversation while she remained quietly supportive at his side. That woman no longer existed. Vanessa returned with 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to him. "You should drink something," she said gently. Daniel accepted the glass without looking at her. "You seem surprised," Vanessa continued after a moment. Daniel finally spoke. "She used to tell me she wanted to build programs like this," he said slowly. Vanessa raised one eyebrow. "And what did you say?" Daniel stared into the clear water swirling inside his glass. "I told her ideas were easy. Execution was what mattered." Vanessa studied him carefully. "Looks like she figured out the execution part." Daniel did not respond. At the center of the ballroom, Alexander leaned closer to Emma as they paused beside one of the donor tables. "You are handling this perfectly," he said quietly. Emma smiled faintly. "It feels strange," she admitted. 3 years ago, I could barely imagine being back in a room like this." Alexander glanced around the ballroom, where dozens of guests now watched them with admiration. "Life has a way of surprising us when we stop listening to the people who doubt us," he said. Emma followed his gaze briefly, and once again noticed Daniel near the back of the room. This time the distance between them felt even larger than before. Not because of the space across the ballroom, but because the version of her life that once included him had quietly faded into the past. The gentle clinking of silverware and quiet conversation continued to ripple across the ballroom as the dinner service settled into a comfortable rhythm. Candlelight flickered across polished tables while the orchestra played a soft arrangement that floated through the high ceiling like a calm evening breeze. Emma Hayes moved gracefully from one group of guests to another, thanking donors and answering questions about the foundation's expansion plans. Every person she spoke with listened carefully, not out of obligation but with genuine respect. It was a different kind of attention than the social politeness she had once known during her marriage to Daniel Brooks. This attention came from people who recognized the work behind the name. Near the back of the ballroom, Daniel stood with his shoulders slightly tense, watching the scene unfold. Vanessa leaned against the bar beside him, swirling the ice in her glass thoughtfully. "You keep staring," she said quietly. Daniel did not deny it. "I am trying to understand when everything changed," he replied. Vanessa followed his gaze toward Emma, who was now speaking with 2 university administrators and a technology investor. "Maybe it did not change overnight," she suggested. "Maybe she just kept going when everyone else assumed she would stop." Daniel felt a faint pressure in his chest as he listened. For years he had believed ambition belonged to the loudest voice in the room. Yet Emma had built something powerful without ever needing to raise her voice at all. At the center of the ballroom, Alexander and Emma paused near a tall window overlooking the glowing city skyline. Outside, the lights of Manhattan stretched for miles like a field of quiet stars. Alexander handed her a glass of sparkling water. "You look thoughtful," he said gently. Emma exhaled slowly, letting the cool glass rest in her hand. "It is strange," she admitted. 3 years ago, I walked away from a life I thought defined me. Tonight it feels like that life belonged to someone else entirely. Alexander studied her expression with quiet understanding. Sometimes the hardest part of rebuilding is realizing you were stronger than the story people told about you, he said. Emma smiled softly at that. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally pushed himself away from the bar. His steps carried him slowly along the edge of the room as he tried to steady the restless thoughts in his mind. He had spent years believing Emma's ideas were unrealistic dreams. Now he was standing inside one of those dreams, watching it succeed on a scale he had never imagined. Several guests passed him while discussing the Foundation's new education initiative. One woman said warmly, "Mrs. Hayes has such a clear vision for these programs. It is inspiring." Daniel paused when he heard that. The words echoed quietly in his thoughts. A clear vision. He had never asked Emma enough questions to understand that vision when they were married. He had simply assumed he already knew her limits. As he moved closer to the center of the ballroom, he saw Emma again, standing beside Alexander beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. The two of them were laughing softly with a group of donors. There was an ease between them that came from mutual respect rather than expectation. Daniel realized something in that moment that felt both obvious and humbling. Emma had not become stronger because someone powerful rescued her. She had become stronger because she finally stepped into a life where her voice was valued. And in that life, she had discovered a confidence that had been waiting quietly within her all along. The dinner service gradually gave way to the softer rhythm of evening conversation as the orchestra shifted into a brighter melody that drifted through the ballroom like a quiet celebration. Guests leaned back in their chairs, glasses raised, the earlier tension replaced by a relaxed admiration for the hosts of the evening. Emma Hayes stood beside one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, while Alexander spoke with a group of Foundation partners. The lights of New York shimmered far below, stretching for miles like a living constellation. Emma rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, taking a moment to breathe in the calm that had settled over the evening. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to reflect on the path that had brought her here. 3 years earlier, she had walked out of a marriage feeling smaller than she had ever imagined possible. She had questioned her own abilities, her own voice, and even her own dreams. Yet standing here now, surrounded by the results of years of patient work, she realized something quietly powerful. None of the success around her had appeared suddenly. It had been built day by day through choices that no one else had noticed at the time. Across the ballroom, Daniel Brooks slowly approached the center of the room, his steps measured as if he were still deciding whether he truly belonged here anymore. Vanessa remained near the bar, watching him with a thoughtful expression but making no attempt to follow. Daniel's eyes moved toward Emma again. The distance between them was no longer defined by embarrassment or anger. Instead, it felt like the closing of a long chapter he had never expected to revisit. Alexander finished speaking with the donors and turned toward Emma just as Daniel approached within a few steps. For a moment, the three of them stood in a small triangle beneath the warm chandelier light. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. "Emma," he said. The name sounded different on his tongue now, softer than before. Emma turned to face him with calm composure. "Daniel," she replied politely. Alexander observed the exchange without tension, his posture relaxed but attentive. Daniel glanced briefly toward him before returning his attention to Emma. "I did not realize how much you had accomplished," he admitted slowly. Emma studied him for a moment, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who had already made peace with the past. "There was a lot you did not see back then," she said gently. Daniel nodded once. "That is true." He looked around the ballroom where guests were still speaking warmly about the Foundation and its impact. "You built something remarkable," he added. Emma's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I did not build it alone," she said, glancing briefly toward Alexander. Alexander smiled faintly, but did not interrupt. Daniel lowered his eyes for a second before meeting Emma's gaze again. "I used to think success meant being the loudest voice in the room," he said quietly. "Tonight, I realized how wrong that was." Emma did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked across the ballroom, where volunteers and donors were discussing future projects inspired by the Foundation's work. Finally, she spoke with calm sincerity. "Success is not about proving someone wrong," she said. "It is about becoming the person you were always meant to be." Daniel absorbed the words slowly. For the first time that evening, the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. Because standing in that room, surrounded by the life Emma had built without him, he understood a truth he could no longer ignore. The woman he once believed needed his approval had never needed it at all. The quiet conversation between Emma, Alexander, and Daniel lingered in the warm glow of the chandeliers for a moment longer before the orchestra shifted into a slightly livelier tune that gently reminded the room the evening was still unfolding. Around them, guests continued speaking in small groups, discussing the foundation's plans and the speech that had clearly moved many of them. Emma noticed the change in the music and glanced toward the stage where the musicians were now preparing for the final portion of the program. The tension that had filled the earlier part of the evening had faded into something more reflective. He looked from Emma to Alexander, and then back to the room, where people continued to approach them with admiration and congratulations. "I should probably let you get back to your guests," Daniel said finally. Emma inclined her head politely. "It was good to see you, Daniel," she replied with calm sincerity. There was no sarcasm in her voice, no trace of the bitterness that once might have lived there. Daniel noticed that immediately. For a moment he seemed about to speak again, but instead he gave a small nod and stepped back into the crowd. As he walked away, the orchestra's melody rose slightly, and the room seemed to breathe again, the earlier confrontation dissolving into the larger celebration of the evening. Emma watched him disappear among the guests for a brief moment before turning her attention back to Alexander. "That felt unexpected," she admitted quietly. Alexander studied her expression with gentle curiosity. "Do you regret speaking with him?" Emma shook her head slowly. "No, I think it was necessary. Sometimes the past needs a moment of closure before it can truly stay in the past." Alexander nodded in quiet agreement. Across the ballroom, the stage lights brightened slightly as the event host stepped forward to introduce the charity auction portion of the evening. Guests began returning to their tables, anticipation building again as volunteers arranged the display items along the stage. A rare art collection, a private island retreat, and several exclusive travel experiences were presented as the first items available for bidding. Emma and Alexander moved toward one of the front tables reserved for the foundation leadership. As they walked, several guests stopped them to offer praise for the speech and the new initiative. One donor said warmly, "Mrs. Hayes, your words tonight reminded everyone why this foundation matters." Emma thanked him graciously. When they reached the table, Alexander pulled out a chair for her and sat beside her with an easy smile. The auctioneer's voice soon filled the ballroom with lively enthusiasm as the bidding began, hands lifting across the room with playful competition. Emma watched the room carefully, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle within her. This event was no longer just a formal gathering of wealthy donors. It had become a space where real opportunities were being created for people who needed them. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom, Daniel Brooks paused one last time before leaving the event. He turned briefly to look toward the front of the room, where Emma sat beside Alexander beneath the bright stage lights. The woman he once believed would always stand behind him was now leading a future that had nothing to do with his approval. For the first time in years, Daniel understood that the most powerful transformations rarely happen loudly. They happen quietly, until one day the entire world finally notices. The charity auction continued to unfold with lively energy as the auctioneer's confident voice echoed across the ballroom. One item after another was presented beneath the bright stage lights, while guests lifted their paddles with polite competitiveness. Laughter and applause followed every successful bid, and the total funds raised climbed steadily on the large display screen near the stage. Emma Hayes watched the room with quiet satisfaction as the numbers continued to rise. Each bid represented another opportunity for students, teachers, and families whose lives might soon be changed by the programs the foundation had built. Alexander leaned slightly closer to her as the next item was announced. "The island retreat usually brings in a serious bidding war," he said softly. Emma smiled faintly. "People seem much more generous when there is an ocean view involved." The bidding began immediately, and within minutes the price had doubled, drawing impressed murmurs from the crowd. Emma glanced around the ballroom once more, noticing the way guests who had arrived as social acquaintances were now speaking to one another about partnerships, new ideas, and future projects. The foundation had done more than raise money tonight. It had sparked a sense of possibility in the room. Across the ballroom near the exit doors, Daniel Brooks paused again as he prepared to leave. Exhaled slowly. I am thinking about how little I understood her when we were married. Vanessa studied his expression. Sometimes people only reveal who they truly are when they stop trying to prove themselves to someone else. Daniel nodded faintly at that. For years he had believed he was the one guiding their future. Now he realized Emma had always been carrying a vision of her own, one he had never taken the time to truly see. Inside the ballroom, the auctioneer raised his gavel as the final item closed with a record-breaking bid that sent applause sweeping through the room. Emma looked up at the screen displaying the evening's total and felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest. The number represented thousands of future opportunities for students who might never have believed a college education was possible. Alexander noticed the look in her eyes and smiled. You built something that matters, he said quietly. Emma shook her head gently. We built it together, she replied. The orchestra began playing a celebratory melody as the host thanked the guests for their generosity. Volunteers and foundation staff gathered near the stage, their faces bright with pride after months of planning the event. Emma stood beside Alexander as they greeted donors one last time, offering their gratitude and discussing the next steps for the foundation's projects.